My name is Iris Caldwell. I'm in my early 40s, married, professionally stable, and, according to most people who know me, remarkably understanding. That's usually said as a compliment. I've learned that it's also a warning label. When you're known for being understanding, people begin to assume you will understand everything, even the things that slowly diminish you. I've never been the loudest person in the room. I don't compete for attention. I don't dramatize discomfort. I grew up believing that maturity meant patience and that love meant flexibility. So I became very good at adjusting, at smoothing edges. I was telling myself that certain things didn't matter as much as they quietly did. From the outside, my life looked calm, even enviable. Inside, it was orderly, but increasingly hollow. People tend to underestimate me because I don't rush to assert myself. They mistake stillness for passivity, silence for agreement. What they don't see is that I observe more than I react. I register tone changes, patterns, and omissions. I notice what isn't asked just as clearly as what is. I've always believed that how someone includes you says more than how loudly they claim to love you. This story isn't about betrayal in the obvious sense. There was no affair, no explosive argument, no single moment that clearly divided before and after. It's about something quieter and far more common. It's about how consideration erodes, slowly enough that you keep adapting to it. It's about how romance doesn't disappear overnight, but fades when small decisions keep being made without you. Romance fades when consideration disappears. The moment that finally made everything visible sounds almost trivial. When said out loud, my husband invited his friends on our anniversary trip without telling me. That sentence alone tends to trigger strong reactions. People imagine rage, confrontation, humiliation. What actually happened was subtler and more revealing. There was no shouting, no scene, just a quiet internal click, like a door closing without being slammed. What followed wasn't revenge. It wasn't a dramatic exit or a speech designed to wound. It was a process, a reevaluation, a series of calm, deliberate choices made after I stopped explaining away what I was feeling. I didn't want to punish anyone. I wanted to understand what had been lost and whether it could be recovered without me shrinking further to accommodate it. Over the course of this story, I'll take you through the emotional terrain of a marriage where I was dependable, present, and increasingly invisible. I'll talk about the small dismissals that were easy to forgive, the roles I accepted without realizing the cost, and the moment I understood that silence can either erase you or protect you, depending on how you use it. I'm telling this story honestly, without exaggeration or cruelty, not to assign villains, but to trace cause and effect. Because sometimes the most powerful shifts don't come from confrontation, but from clarity. So before we go any further, let me ask you, gently and without judgment, have you ever realized too late that you were being included out of habit, not intention? For a long time, I believed I knew exactly who I was in my marriage. I was the steady one, the reasonable one, the person you could rely on not to complicate things. To my husband, Mark, I was dependable. I handled logistics without complaint, travel planning, calendars, reminders, birthdays, the quiet maintenance of a shared life. I remembered details, so he didn't have to. I smoothed over inconveniences before they became problems. When plans shifted, I adapted. When something felt off, I told myself it wasn't worth turning into a thing. To his friends, I was pleasant background noise. The wife who smiled, listened, poured drinks, and asked about their jobs. I wasn't disliked. I was simply assumed. If I were there, fine. If I wasn't, also fine. I fit easily into the margins of their gatherings, which made me invisible in a way no one ever had to confront. At work, I was known as solid. Not flashy, not dramatic. The person who would catch what others missed and fix it quietly. That reputation followed me home more than I realized. Reliability became my defining feature everywhere, and slowly it replaced being seen. The strange thing is, no one ever told me outright that my needs mattered less. There was no announcement, no declaration. It showed up in smaller ways, in how decisions were framed as already made by the time they reached me, and how my preferences were treated as flexible while others were treated as fixed, and how appreciation was implied rather than expressed. And because nothing was overtly cruel, I didn't protest. I told myself this was what partnership looked like after enough years together. Less novelty, more efficiency. Less romance, more rhythm. I believed maturity meant not keeping score, not asking for reassurance, not needing to be consulted on everything. I mistook endurance for depth. When friends described me as low maintenance, I smiled. I didn't question why being low maintenance was considered ideal. I didn't ask what happens to a person when they're valued primarily for how little they ask for. Mark would often say, "You're so understanding," when plans changed or when something slipped his mind. At the time, it felt like appreciation. In hindsight, it was permission. Permission to keep not checking in. Permission to keep assuming I'd adjust. I became very good at pre-adjusting. I'd sense when it wasn't a good time to bring something up. I'd downplay disappointments before they reached my face. I'd tell myself it's not a big deal, so convincingly that I almost believed it. Almost. The truth is, I wasn't unhappy in a dramatic way. There were no daily tears, no constant tension. There was just a quiet flattening, a sense that my presence filled space, but didn't shape it. That I was essential, but not central. If I went quiet, no one worried. If I didn't express an opinion, someone else supplied one. If I agreed quickly, it made things easier for everyone. Ease became my contribution. And because ease is comfortable, no one questions the cost of it. Including me became optional because I had taught people I'd be fine either way. I don't say this with bitterness. I say it with clarity. Because invisibility isn't something that's always imposed. Sometimes it's something you slowly step into because it feels safer than being inconvenient. At that stage of my life, I believed being loved meant being agreeable. I believed being chosen once meant I would continue to be chosen without effort. I didn't realize that consideration isn't something you earn permanently. It's something that has to be renewed again and again through attention. And attention, I was slowly learning, had shifted elsewhere. Still, if you had asked me then whether anything was wrong, I would have said no. I would have meant it. Because when you're used to being the stable one, you don't recognize the warning signs as warnings. You recognize them as responsibilities. The first moment I remember clearly didn't feel important at the time. That's what makes it stand out now. It was a Saturday afternoon, months before the anniversary trip was even discussed. Mark had mentioned, casually, that he might meet a few friends to watch a game that evening. He didn't frame it as a plan, more like a possibility. I nodded, already adjusting my expectations. We hadn't talked about dinner, but I assumed we'd check in later. Around 4 o'clock, I asked if he knew what time he'd be heading out. "Oh," he said, not looking up from his phone. "We're actually meeting earlier. I told them I'd be there by 5. It was a small word, a harmless one, but it landed strangely. I asked lightly when that had been decided. "Earlier today," he said. I didn't think it would matter. There it was. Not dismissive, not unkind, just factual. I smiled, said okay, and told him to have fun. He thanked me for being flexible, kissed my cheek, and left. I stood in the kitchen afterward, unsure why I felt unsettled. Nothing objectively bad had happened. He hadn't broken a promise. He hadn't lied. He hadn't excluded me intentionally. At least that's what I told myself. But something had shifted. It wasn't about the game or the friends. It was about how easily a decision had been made without me, and how naturally my role was to accommodate it. The assumption wasn't that I'd been consulted. It was that I'd understand after the fact. I didn't bring it up later. I didn't want to sound needy. I didn't want to overinterpret something so minor. I told myself this was what trust looked like. Independence, not constant coordination. Except independence goes both ways, and this didn't feel like that. Over the next few weeks, similar moments appeared, not enough to form a pattern yet, just enough to create a faint outline. A dinner was added to the calendar without mentioning it to me first. A weekend plan described as already in motion, a phrase I started hearing more often. I assumed you'd be fine with it. Each time I nodded, each time I adjusted, each time I felt a brief sting that I quickly smoothed over. No one else noticed. Why would they? I wasn't reacting. I wasn't objecting. From the outside, everything looked harmonious. Mark would even mention how lucky he was to have a wife who didn't make things difficult. That sentence should have stopped me. It didn't. I had learned somewhere along the way that being easy to be with was a virtue, that asking to be included explicitly was somehow less evolved. I confused emotional self-sufficiency with emotional absence. The first small cut didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. It just reminded me, quietly, that my presence was no longer required at the moment of decision, only at the moment of adjustment. And because I didn't name it, it went unacknowledged. Unacknowledged things have a way of repeating themselves. I remember one evening, lying in bed beside him, scrolling through my phone, thinking about how strange it felt to miss something I hadn't asked for. I wondered if I was being oversensitive, if this was just what long-term relationships look like when the novelty wore off. I chose the explanation that required the least disruption. I didn't realize then that every time I chose silence over clarity, I was teaching people how to treat my silence. I was setting expectations I didn't intend to set. The first small cut wasn't about pain. It was about information, and I ignored what it was trying to tell me. Once something happens more than once, it stops feeling accidental. I didn't notice the shift all at once. It crept in quietly, disguised as normal life. Plans changed, schedules overlapped, people got busy. These were all reasonable explanations, and I used them generously. Every small dismissal came with a justification ready-made. Stress at work, a last-minute opportunity, a misunderstanding. What I didn't notice, at least not immediately, was how often the benefit of the doubt went in only one direction. Mark stopped checking in before committing to things that affected both of us. Not always, but often enough that it became unremarkable. He'd tell me about plans as if they were updates, not invitations. And because I didn't object, they became habits. I told myself I was choosing peace. If I raised a concern, it would be framed as me being sensitive. Not overtly, never cruelly, but subtly. A sigh, a reminder that it wasn't a big deal. A reassurance that I was still important, delivered without any corresponding change in behavior. So I learned to let things go before they could become conversations. I started editing myself in real time. I'd feel the initial reaction, disappointment, confusion, a flicker of hurt, and then I'd override it with logic. It's not intentional. He didn't mean it that way. Other couples deal with worse. That inner negotiation became automatic. Friends would comment on how laid back I was, how secure. I accepted the praise without asking what it cost me. Security, I was learning, had begun to mean self-erasure. The more I adapted, the less anyone expected me to need adapting for. My preferences faded into the background. When I did express one, it felt like a disruption rather than a contribution. I started to preempt that feeling by staying quiet. This is how disrespect becomes normalized, not through cruelty, but through convenience. I remember a conversation with Mark where he mentioned a weekend trip he'd tentatively agreed to with friends. I asked when he was thinking of going. "Oh, it's already booked," he said. "I assumed you'd be okay staying back." He said it kindly, casually, as if the assumption itself was proof of intimacy. I nodded again. That night, I lay awake longer than usual, trying to locate the exact emotion I was feeling. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was something flatter, a sense of being slightly misaligned with my own life. I began to notice how often I was the one adjusting my calendar, my energy, my expectations. How rarely did anyone check whether that adjustment was actually easy for me. How often my flexibility was mistaken for preference. And still, I said nothing, because saying something would require admitting that something had been lost. And I wasn't ready to do that yet. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being physically present, but emotionally peripheral. It doesn't scream, it hums. It settles into the background noise of your days until you stop noticing it as a problem and start accepting it as atmosphere. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself this was the difference between love in movies and love in real life. I told myself that needing consideration was childish and that real partnership meant adapting without complaint. But part of me knew that something was off. I could feel it in the way I hesitated before speaking, in the way I rehearsed my reactions internally to ensure they wouldn't inconvenience anyone, in the way I felt relief when plans didn't include me, because at least then I wouldn't have to negotiate my own invisibility. Normalizing disrespect doesn't require malice. It requires silence. It requires one person to keep absorbing the impact so that no one else has to adjust. I absorbed a lot, and because I did it quietly, everyone, including me, started to believe this was just who I was. At some point, without any discussion, I realized I had been given a role. Not formally, not intentionally, but clearly. I was the one who would understand, the one who would adapt, the one who would make things easier rather than question whether they should be this way in the first place. That role fit me well because I had shaped myself to fit it. Once a role is assigned, people stop seeing the person underneath it. I noticed how conversations changed when I entered a room. Not in a dramatic way, just subtly. Decisions had already been made. Details had already been agreed upon. I was brought in at the end to be informed, not included. And because I rarely objected, my silence was interpreted as consent. Mark would often say, "You're so calm about these things," as if calmness were my natural state rather than a practiced one. He didn't see the calculation behind it, the quick assessment of whether speaking up would actually change anything or simply label me as difficult. I had become reliable in a way that was no longer reciprocal. When something needed to be organized, I was asked. When something needed to be sacrificed, I volunteered without being asked. When something needed to be considered, I was considered last because I had taught everyone that I would manage. There's a particular danger in being capable. People start leaning without checking whether you're still standing comfortably. I remember a dinner with friends where plans for an upcoming holiday were being discussed. Everyone was excited, talking over each other, throwing out ideas. At some point, someone turned to me and said, "Iris will be fine with whatever, right?" It was said with a smile, a joke. I smiled back, nodded. Inside, something tightened. That was the moment I understood that my preferences were no longer expected. They were optional, decorative. The assumption wasn't that I'd be consulted. It was that I'd comply. I wasn't angry at them. I was unsettled by myself, by how easily I had allowed this version of me to become the default. Roles once established are hard to challenge because they benefit everyone except the person playing them. They create comfort and predictability, and when you try to step out of them, it feels like disruption rather than growth. I had been cast as the reasonable wife, the emotionally low-maintenance partner, the woman who didn't need much, and because that role made life smoother for others, no one questioned whether it made life smaller for me. Including me became a courtesy, not a necessity. I started to see how often my contributions were invisible because they prevented problems rather than creating moments. You don't notice the person who keeps things running smoothly. You notice the absence of chaos. And I had become excellent at preventing chaos. But prevention doesn't earn presence. There was a quiet grief in realizing that people love the role more than they notice the person. That my value had become functional rather than relational, useful, not cherished. I didn't confront anyone about this realization, not yet, because I needed to be sure it was real, not just a passing insecurity. I watched more carefully, listened more closely. I paid attention to patterns rather than moments, and the pattern was consistent. I was assigned the role of the one who would always be okay. The problem with that role is that once you accept it, no one asks whether you actually are. The day something shifted didn't look like a breaking point. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic revelation. It was an ordinary weekday morning, the kind that usually passed without leaving a mark. That's why it took me a while to understand that it mattered. Mark was standing at the kitchen counter scrolling through his phone, coffee growing cold beside him. I was packing my bag for work, moving through familiar motions. We were talking in fragments. Comments about traffic, weather, the usual background noise of a shared life. Then he said, almost absent-mindedly, "I might be out of town next month." I paused, just slightly. "Oh," I said, "for work?" No, he replied. "Just something the guys are planning. I'll know more later." He went back to his phone, conversation over. It wasn't the trip itself. It was the way the information was delivered, casually, conclusively, without space for response. Are you okay with this? No, we should talk about timing. Just a statement of fact dropped into the room like furniture being rearranged without notice. In that moment, something inside me went very still. I realized I wasn't surprised. That was the first signal. If this had happened a year earlier, I might have felt a pang of disappointment or confusion. Now, I felt a quiet recognition. Of course, I thought. This is how things work now. That thought frightened me more than anger ever could. I finished packing my bag. I told him to have a good day. I drove to work and sat in traffic, noticing how calm I felt and how detached. It was as if something had loosened its grip. Not on him, on me. At my desk, I couldn't focus. Not because I was upset, but because a question kept returning. Steady and unignorable. When did I stop being part of the planning of my own life? I replayed months of interactions in my mind. Not to assign blame, but to trace the logic. Each small accommodation. Each time I chose ease over expression. Each moment, I told myself it wasn't worth addressing. The shift wasn't about resentment. It was about awareness. I saw, clearly for the first time, that my silence hadn't preserved harmony. It had rewritten the terms. I had been opting out of my own agency in the name of being agreeable. And now, that opt-out had become the expectation. That afternoon, I went for a walk during my lunch break. I didn't listen to music. I wanted to hear my own thoughts without distraction. I asked myself a question I'd been avoiding. If nothing changes, can I live like this indefinitely? The answer came quickly. No drama, just certainty. What surprised me was the absence of urgency. I didn't feel the need to confront Mark immediately or demand explanations. I didn't feel the impulse to reclaim space through volume. Instead, I felt something steadier. Resolve. Not to punish, not to threaten, but to stop participating in my own erasure. That day marked the end of something, though I didn't announce it. It was the end of automatic accommodation. The end of assuming that being loved meant being flexible beyond recognition. The end of confusing patience with passivity. I didn't change my behavior outwardly, not yet. But internally, a line had been drawn. I began to observe not just what was happening, but how it made me feel, without immediately overriding that feeling. I let discomfort exist without smoothing it over. I treated it as information, rather than a flaw to be corrected. By the time I got home that evening, nothing looked different. Dinner was made. The conversation was polite. Life continued as usual. But I knew that something fundamental had shifted. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't asking how to be easier to live with. I was asking how to live honestly, with myself. After that day, my silence changed texture. Before it had been reflexive, an instinctive smoothing over of anything that might cause friction. Now it was deliberate. I still didn't speak much, but not because I was afraid of being inconvenient. I was listening, watching, letting patterns complete themselves without interruption. This kind of silence isn't empty, it's observant. I stopped preemptively offering reassurance. When Mark mentioned plans in passing, I didn't immediately respond with understanding or flexibility. I acknowledged the information and let it rest there. No emotional cushioning, no immediate validation. At first, nothing happened. Then slowly, I noticed confusion. He would pause after telling me something, as if waiting for the familiar response that didn't come. When it didn't, he'd fill the gap himself. I mean, unless you had something else in mind, he'd add, almost as an afterthought. I didn't rush to answer. I didn't confront him either. I simply allowed the silence to exist long enough for it to register. People often think silence is weakness. It isn't. Not when it's chosen. When you stop filling space, others become aware of how much you used to carry. I also stopped volunteering. If something needed organizing, I waited to be asked. If no one asked, I let it go. This wasn't spite. It was recalibration. I needed to see what would happen if I stopped holding everything together by default. What happened was revealing. Some things simply didn't happen. Plans fell through, details were missed. Minor inconveniences appeared where none had before. And with them came mild irritation, not directed at me, but at the situation. No one connected the dots. I didn't correct the course. I let the natural consequences unfold. Emotionally, this period was quieter than I expected. Without the constant internal editing, I felt less exhausted. I wasn't suppressing reactions. I was postponing responses until they felt necessary. Mark seemed to interpret my calm as compliance. He assumed that because I wasn't objecting, everything was fine. That assumption worked in my favor. It gave me space. I started redirecting my energy inward. I paid closer attention to my own routines, my own priorities. I spent time alone without explaining it. I reconnected with parts of myself that had gone dormant, not in rebellion, but in recovery. Silence became a boundary, not a wall, a filter. I began keeping notes, not about Mark, but about myself. How I felt after certain interactions, what I missed, what I no longer wanted to normalize. Writing clarified things in a way conversation never had. The more I observed, the clearer it became. My absence of resistance had been mistaken for absence of need. And now that I had stopped compensating, that misunderstanding was starting to show cracks. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of victory, just information accumulating, piece by piece. One evening, Mark asked if everything was okay. The question was vague, almost reflexive. Yes, I said, and I meant it, because for the first time in a long while, I wasn't betraying myself in the name of peace. Silence had stopped being something that happened to me. It had become something I was using, carefully, intentionally, to see clearly. What they never noticed was how much I was paying attention. Because I wasn't reacting, it looked like nothing was happening. But beneath that calm surface, I was preparing. Not for conflict, but for truth. I needed to understand my position clearly before I made any decisions. Not emotionally, structurally. I started by observing facts rather than interpretations. Who initiated plans? Who adjusted when conflicts arose? Whose time was treated as fixed and whose was treated as flexible? I noticed how often my calendar was assumed to be open by default. How rarely anyone asked what I wanted to do before deciding what we would do. I stopped telling myself stories to soften those observations. I didn't frame them as temporary phases or stress responses. I let them stand as data. At the same time, I began quietly refamiliarizing myself with areas of my life I had left on an autopilot. Finances, long-term plans, commitments that had been made years earlier and never revisited. Not because I was planning to leave, but because I realized how little I actually knew about the structure of the life I was maintaining. That realization unsettled me. I had trusted the idea of partnership more than I had verified its mechanics. I assumed balance where there was convenience. I assumed security where there was a habit. So I started learning, not dramatically, not in secretive ways, just intentionally. I reviewed documents. I reread emails. I looked at shared accounts, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I wanted to know where I stood if I ever needed to stand alone. This wasn't preparation for escape, it was preparation for the agency. Emotionally, I began to notice how much energy I had been expending on smoothing interactions that no longer required smoothing. Without that constant output, I felt steadier, less reactive, more grounded in myself. Mark, meanwhile, seemed comfortable. My silence hadn't triggered an alarm. It had reinforced the idea that things were fine. He continued as before, unaware that the ground had shifted. Not beneath him, but beneath me. I didn't correct his assumptions. Not because I wanted to deceive him, but because I needed to understand the full shape of the situation without interference. Sometimes, clarity requires uninterrupted observation. I also began documenting, not grievances, but moments, dates, conversations, decisions made without consultation. Not to build a case against anyone, but to counteract my own tendency to forget, forgive, and minimize. Writing things down changed how real they felt. Patterns that could be dismissed individually became undeniable in sequence. It wasn't about one anniversary trip or one missed conversation. It was about a consistent absence of consideration that had become normalized through my compliance. What surprised me most during this period was the absence of anger. I wasn't furious. I wasn't plotting. I was calm, focused, almost clinical. That calm scared me more than rage would have, because it meant I was no longer fighting to preserve the image of the relationship. I was evaluating its substance. I also noticed how rarely anyone asked what I was thinking anymore. My quiet had become familiar, expected. When you stop expressing needs, people stop imagining you have them. That realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It clarified things. I understood now that my leverage had never been loudness or confrontation. It was competence, consistency, the invisible labor that kept everything running. And if that labor had become invisible, its absence would eventually be felt, even if no one could immediately explain why. Still, I wasn't ready to act, not yet. This phase wasn't about execution. It was about positioning, about making sure that when I did choose, I wouldn't be choosing from fear or confusion, but from understanding. What they never noticed was that my quiet wasn't emptiness. It was preparation. The private reveal didn't arrive with shock or triumph. It arrived with stillness. By then, I had gathered enough information to stop guessing. The picture that formed wasn't dramatic. It was precise. And once I saw it clearly, I couldn't unsee it. The reveal wasn't about discovering a secret affair or hidden betrayal. It was more unsettling than that. It was the realization that my role in the marriage had shifted from partner to infrastructure. Necessary, but not actively considered. Relied upon, but not consulted. What became clear was this. Mark didn't exclude me because he didn't care at all. He excluded me because he didn't have to think about me to keep things functioning. I had made myself so adaptable, so reliable, that my presence was no longer a variable in his decisions. That was the truth. And once I understood it, I felt something unexpected. Relief. Because it meant I wasn't imagining things. I wasn't overly sensitive. I wasn't asking for too much. I had simply outgrown a dynamic that depended on my silence to survive. The anniversary trip confirmed it, quietly but definitively. Mark mentioned it one evening as we were cleaning up after dinner. He said he'd booked a weekend away. Something nice, he said. When I asked where, he named the destination casually, then added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and the guys are thinking of coming too. Just for part of it." I looked at him. He didn't look back. He kept talking, explaining logistics, laughing lightly about how it would be fun and low pressure. He didn't ask how I felt. He didn't pause. He had already organized the idea in his mind as reasonable. In that moment, I didn't feel hurt. I felt clarity. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't thoughtlessness. It was consistency. He truly didn't register the anniversary as something that required my central presence, because our emotional center had already shifted elsewhere. And the most important part of the reveal was this. I knew with certainty that explaining it wouldn't change it, not in any lasting way. I could tell him it hurt. He would apologize. He might even cancel or adjust the plan. But the underlying assumption that my needs were flexible, optional, secondary, would remain intact, because it had been reinforced over time. That understanding settled everything. I didn't argue. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice or ask him to reconsider. I simply said, "Okay," and meant something very different from what he thought. Privately, I acknowledged what this moment represented. It wasn't the worst thing that could happen. It was the clearest. I saw then that my leverage wasn't about control or confrontation. It was about choice. And choice requires acceptance of reality, not negotiation with illusion. That night, lying in bed beside him, I didn't feel lonely. I felt resolved. The relationship I thought I was protecting no longer existed in the way I needed it to. And that wasn't something I could fix by being more patient or more understanding. The reveal wasn't that he had changed. It was what I had. And once that line is crossed, there's no going back to unknowing. I slept deeply that night, not because everything was okay, but because I finally stopped pretending it was. Once you see something clearly, you can't negotiate with yourself about it anymore. That was where I found myself, not in crisis, not in panic, but at a decision point that felt strangely calm. I wasn't deciding whether something was wrong. I was deciding what I was willing to live with now that I knew. There were several paths available to me, and I considered each one carefully. I could confront Mark directly, lay everything out, explain how excluded I felt, how the anniversary trip crossed a line, how the pattern mattered more than the incident. I could ask for a change, request counseling, or insist on recalibration. That option came with hope, but also with a familiar cost. It would require me to do the emotional labor again, to translate my experience into a language palatable enough to be received, to wait and see whether insight would turn into sustained action. I knew that terrain well. Another option was to stay exactly as things were, to accept that this marriage had evolved into something quieter, more functional, less intimate. and to decide that this was enough. Many people do that. There is safety in predictability. There is comfort in minimizing desire. I could continue being the reasonable one and build a life around not needing too much. That option felt peaceful on the surface. It felt dead underneath. There was also the option of dramatic exit, of forcing a reckoning through shock. But that didn't appeal to me. I didn't want to be understood because I exploded. I wanted my actions to align with my values, not react against someone else's limitations. So I looked for the option that preserved my integrity. The decision I made wasn't loud. It wasn't announced, but it was irreversible. I decided to stop centering my life around a relationship that no longer centered me. That didn't mean immediate departure. It meant internal realignment. It meant that every choice going forward would be filtered through a new question. Does this require me to disappear to maintain it? If the answer was yes, I wouldn't choose it anymore. That decision clarified everything. I stopped negotiating internally about whether my needs were valid. I stopped waiting for inclusion. I stopped hoping someone else would notice the imbalance and fix it for me. This wasn't withdrawal. It was reclaiming authorship. From that point on, my energy shifted, not away from Mark and anger, but toward myself with intention. I began prioritizing stability that didn't depend on someone else's awareness. I began imagining a future that wasn't contingent on being chosen by default. The calmness of that realization surprised me. There was no grief yet, just resolve. Grief would come later, I knew. But grief requires honesty first. Mark didn't notice the decision when I made it. Why would he? Nothing outward had changed. I was still kind, still present, still composed. That was the quiet dominance of it, choosing without performing. The decision point wasn't about him. It was about my refusing to live on borrowed consideration. Once that decision was made, everything else became logistics. Once the decision was made, I didn't feel urgency. That surprised me. I had expected anxiety, maybe fear. Instead, I felt methodical. When you stop arguing with reality, you gain time. And time, used carefully, becomes leverage. I didn't announce any changes. I didn't create distance in obvious ways. Outwardly, life continued as it always had. I went to work. We shared meals. We spoke about neutral things. If anyone had looked in from the outside, they would have seen stability. Internally, I had shifted from emotional participation to strategic observation. I began separating what was shared by habit from what was shared by intention. Finances were the first area I examined, not with suspicion, but with clarity. I reviewed accounts, contributions, and responsibilities. I made copies of documents I had never thought to keep before, not because I expected conflict, but because I expected honesty with myself. I realized how much I had trusted the idea of us without checking whether that idea was still mutual. I didn't drain accounts. I didn't hide money. I simply ensured that I knew exactly where I stood. Independence doesn't require secrecy. It requires awareness. I also began redirecting my time, quietly. I accepted a long-delayed professional opportunity that required occasional travel. I reconnected with colleagues I had deprioritized. I invested in skills I had postponed because they weren't necessary for the life I was living. None of this was announced as a change. It was framed as practicality. Mark noticed pieces of it, but not the pattern. He commented once that I seemed busy lately. I agreed. Busy wasn't a lie. It just wasn't the whole truth. I was building a life that didn't assume automatic inclusion. Emotionally, I stopped offering reassurance where none was requested. When he talked about plans, I listened without absorbing responsibility for their impact. I didn't ask follow-up questions designed to soften outcomes. I let decisions stand on their own. That, more than anything, altered the atmosphere, not dramatically, subtly. Small inconveniences appeared. Gaps in coordination. Things I used to anticipate were no longer anticipated. Not out of spite, but because I was no longer centering my attention around preventing discomfort that wasn't mine to manage. Mark compensated in small ways, unconsciously. He double-checked details more often. He hesitated before committing to plans. But because he didn't understand why, the effort was inconsistent. I didn't correct him. This phase wasn't about teaching lessons. It was about seeing whether the system could rebalance without my constant intervention. It couldn't. And that knowledge was important. The silence I moved in wasn't cold. It was neutral. Neutrality gives you a clear read on reality because it removes emotional distortion. Without my cushioning, the imbalance became visible, not just to me, but slowly to him. Still, he didn't name it. Most people don't notice change when it happens quietly. They notice only when comfort is gone. By the time the anniversary trip approached, my internal structure was solid. I knew what I could handle. I knew what I wouldn't compromise anymore. I knew that whatever came next, I would not need to scramble. Moving in silence doesn't mean hiding. It means acting without needing permission. Consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as an absence. At first, nothing dramatic happened. No confrontation, no explosion, just a series of small disruptions that no one could quite explain. Things that used to flow smoothly began to feel slightly off. Plans overlapped. Details were forgotten. Emotional cues were missed, not because I was withholding deliberately, but because I was no longer compensating. Mark began to feel it before he understood it. He mentioned once that things felt disconnected lately. He didn't say we. He said things, as if the atmosphere itself had shifted for no clear reason. I listened. I didn't argue with his perception or rush to repair it. I asked him what he meant. He hesitated, shrugged, said he wasn't sure. That was the first real sign. When someone loses the benefit of your invisible labor, they feel the loss long before they understand the cause. He forgot an important date, not the anniversary itself, but a related commitment that I used to quietly manage. When it caused inconvenience, he was frustrated, not at me, in the situation. I let the frustration exist without absorbing it. Friends noticed my absence more than my presence. I stopped attending events that didn't interest me without explanation. I declined invitations politely, but without over-justifying. I didn't rearrange my schedule to accommodate gatherings I had never been asked to help plan. People adjusted, slowly. Mark began checking in more often, not with intention, but with uncertainty. "Are you doing anything that weekend?" he'd ask, instead of assuming. It sounded like progress, but it wasn't rooted in understanding. It was a reaction, not a reflection, and reaction doesn't last. The anniversary trip loomed quietly in the background. He mentioned logistics, timelines, who was arriving when. Each time he spoke as if narrating something already decided. I listened without tension. That unnerved him more than anger would have. One evening, he asked if I was looking forward to it. I paused. "Yes," I said honestly, because I was, just not for the reasons he thought. The consequence wasn't that he felt punished. It was that he felt unsteady. The emotional predictability he relied on, my flexibility, my accommodation, was gone, not replaced with hostility, but with neutrality. And neutrality removes the illusion of control. He started noticing how often he filled the space in conversations now, how rarely I volunteered reassurance. My agreement no longer came automatically. Still, he didn't ask the question that mattered. And because he didn't, the consequences continued to unfold quietly. The loss of ease, the loss of assumption, the loss of unquestioned access to my emotional labor. None of it was intentional harm. It was simply what happens when one person stops holding up a structure alone. By the time Mark realized something was wrong, he had already missed the moment when it could have been fixed easily. That's the part people don't talk about enough. There is a window, quiet, brief, when awareness paired with humility can still change things. When someone can say, "I see it now. I didn't mean to, but I did. Help me understand." That window doesn't slam shut loudly. It closes because no one reaches for it in time. Mark reached for it too late. It started with small questions that came out sideways. "Have I done something?" he asked one night, half joking, half concerned. The tone mattered. He was looking for reassurance, not truth. He wanted to know if things were okay enough to continue as they were. I told him I was tired, which was true, just not in the way he meant. He began trying to compensate without understanding. He brought home flowers once, an unprompted gesture that would have meant a lot months earlier. Now it felt disconnected from the issue, like applying pressure to the wrong wound. He suggested dinner, asked if I wanted to do something fun, and floated ideas without anchoring them in reflection. Effort without insight feels like noise. I didn't reject these gestures. I accepted them politely, calmly. That politeness confused him. He was used to either appreciation or resistance. Neutral acceptance gave him no feedback to adjust from. The anniversary trip arrived. His friends joined for part of it, just as planned. The dynamic was exactly what I had expected. Group-oriented, loosely coordinated, centered around shared convenience rather than intimacy. I wasn't upset. I wasn't withdrawn. I was present without being invested. That difference was impossible to ignore. One of his friends commented casually that I seemed different. Mark laughed it off, but later that evening, alone, he asked what that meant. I told him I wasn't sure. That was the truth. The version of me he was noticing wasn't new. It was uncovered. On the final night of the trip, he tried to talk. Do not argue. Talk. He said he felt like he was losing me, that he didn't know when it started, but he could feel it now. I listened, and in that moment, I knew with certainty that it was too late to fix it the way he wanted to, because what he was responding to wasn't my pain. It was his discomfort. He hadn't noticed when I was disappearing. He noticed when I stopped compensating for it. I didn't say that out loud. I told him that I had been feeling alone for a long time, that I didn't think one conversation could undo years of being an afterthought, that I wasn't angry, but I was no longer willing to pretend. He apologized. Sincerely, I believe that. But apologies don't reverse patterns unless they're paired with sustained awareness. And awareness had never been his strength, because my silence had always done that work for him. The panic I saw then wasn't malicious. It was grief mixed with confusion. The realization that something essential had slipped away quietly, without permission. I felt compassion and finality. Too late doesn't mean unforgivable. It means irreversible. The real confrontation didn't happen in a moment of anger. It happened weeks later, in our living room on an ordinary evening. No raised voices, no packed bags by the door. Just two people sitting across from each other, finally speaking from different places than before. Mark asked if we could talk. I agreed. He didn't start with accusations or defensiveness. He looked tired, not physically, emotionally. He said he felt like he was constantly misstepping, like he no longer knew where the ground was with me. I listened without interrupting. When it was my turn, I didn't recount every grievance. I didn't list examples. I didn't argue timelines. I spoke simply. I told him that for a long time I had been making myself smaller to keep things easy, that I had mistaken being accommodating for being loved. That was when he stopped asking, and I kept adjusting. Something fundamental broke. He said he never meant to hurt me. I told him I believed that. Then I said something that surprised him. I don't think this is about intention anymore. That stopped him. I explained that the issue wasn't whether he cared. It was whether the relationship still had room for me as a full participant. That I no longer wanted to teach someone how to consider me. That I needed to be in a dynamic where inclusion wasn't reactive, but natural. He asked what I wanted. I paused before answering. I want a life where I don't have to disappear to be loved. There was no drama in that sentence, just truth. He nodded slowly. He said he wanted to try, to learn, to do better. And here was the hardest part. I believed he meant it. But belief wasn't enough anymore. I told him that I had already changed internally, and that I couldn't promise to reverse that change on hope alone. That I wasn't angry, but I was finished negotiating my worth. The conversation ended without resolution. Not because we were avoiding it, but because some things can't be decided in one sitting. We agreed to take space, not physically but emotionally, to reflect. There was sadness in that room, but no hostility. Confrontation without heat doesn't feel victorious. It feels honest. And honesty, once spoken, doesn't ask to be taken back. I'm not the woman I was when this story began. Not because I hardened and not because I became less kind, but because I stopped confusing endurance with love. I stopped measuring my value by how easy I was to live with. Who I am now is quieter but clearer. I still listen more than I speak. I still notice patterns, but I no longer override my own awareness to protect someone else's comfort. I no longer pre-adjust myself out of the picture. If I'm included, I step forward fully. If I'm not, I step back without resentment. That difference has changed everything. My sense of self is no longer tethered to whether I'm chosen by default. I choose myself deliberately. I invest my energy where it's reciprocated, not merely accepted. That doesn't mean I demand perfection. It means I require presence. I've learned that love without consideration becomes an obligation. An obligation over time breeds invisibility. I don't carry bitterness about my marriage. I carry understanding. I see how easily two people can slide into imbalance when one adapts too well and the other stops checking. I see my part in that. Owning it gave me my agency back. Mark and I didn't end our story in anger. We ended it in clarity. We recognized that the version of us that worked depended on my being less than whole. And once I refused that role, the structure couldn't hold. That doesn't make either of us villains. It makes us incompatible in the way we have become. Now my life is slower in some ways, richer in others. I have space, real space, for my thoughts, my preferences, my boundaries. I no longer explain myself into invisibility. I'm still considerate, but my consideration is no longer automatic. It's chosen, and because it's chosen, it's meaningful. I trust my discomfort now. I treat it as information, not something to be smoothed over. I speak sooner. I listen longer. To myself most of all. If there is dominance in who I am now, it's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It comes from alignment. From knowing that I will not abandon myself to maintain a connection. I didn't gain this clarity through confrontation or triumph. I gained it by being still long enough to see the truth and brave enough to live by it. There's a quiet lesson at the end of this story, and it isn't about blame. It's about attention. Love doesn't usually disappear because of one big mistake. It fades when consideration becomes optional, when inclusion turns into assumption, when one person keeps adapting and the other stops noticing the cost of that adaptation. I stayed silent for a long time because I believed silence preserved peace. What I learned is that silence can preserve an imbalance just as effectively. When you make yourself endlessly flexible, people stop experiencing you as someone who needs to be consulted. Not out of cruelty, but out of habit. Romance fades when consideration disappears. That doesn't mean love was fake, it means it wasn't maintained. If there's one thing I wish I had understood earlier, it's that being easy to be with is not the same as being cherished. Being agreeable doesn't guarantee intimacy. Sometimes it guarantees invisibility. The turning point in my life didn't come from confrontation or victory. It came from clarity, from recognizing that my needs weren't unreasonable. They were simply unmet. And that explaining them repeatedly to someone who benefited from not noticing was costing me more than it was costing them. This story isn't a warning against patience or understanding. Those are beautiful qualities, but they must be balanced with self-respect. When understanding only flows one way, it stops being generosity and starts becoming self-erasure. I don't regret the years I spent trying. I regret only the time I spent convincing myself that the absence of malice meant the presence of care. Care is active. It asks. It notices. It adjusts before damage is done. If you're listening to this and seeing pieces of yourself in it, I want you to know something. You don't have to disappear to be loved. You don't have to earn consideration by being low maintenance. And you don't have to wait for a dramatic breaking point to honor your own clarity. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop explaining yourself and start choosing differently. I'm not telling this story so you'll take sides. I'm telling you so you'll pay attention to the small moments, the assumptions, the ways you're included or not before decisions are made. So I'll leave you with one open question, and I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that the moment someone stopped considering you was the moment you began considering yourself? Thank you for listening.